The Silent Witness. Behind Morrison's Mercantile in Sweetwater, Wyoming territory, a woman knelt in frozen mud, her trembling hands sorting through potato peelings and moldy bread crusts. Two small children huddled against her worn skirts, their hollow eyes watching the alley entrance with animal wariness. They weren't begging. Beggars made noise, drew attention. They were ghosts, surviving on what the living discarded. Ethan Cole stood in the shadows, his scarred hands clenching and unclenching as he watched the town's silent cruelty. For 3 years, he'd kept his head down, his past buried, his ranch empty of everything but regret. Then he stepped forward, and everything changed. Welcome to a story about the moment mercy becomes defiance. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this tale of justice and second chances travels. Now settle in, because what happens next in the Wyoming territory of 1878 will show you what one man's courage can cost and what it can save. The November wind cut through Sweetwater like a dull blade, slow and mean. Ethan Cole had come to town for fence wire and lamp oil, the kind of practical errands that filled the empty hours of a man who'd grown accustomed to silence. He'd tied his horse outside Morrison's and was halfway to the door when he heard it, or rather, didn't hear it. Most desperate people made noise. They pleaded, bargained, made themselves known. But the absence of sound pulled at something in Ethan's chest, some instinct he'd thought the war had killed. He turned toward the alley between the Mercantile and the livery stable. That's when he saw them. The woman was perhaps 30, though hardship had written years across her face that time hadn't yet claimed. Her dress had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. She knelt in the mud beside a pile of refuse, her movements methodical, almost ritualistic, as she sorted through scraps with fingers that shook from cold or hunger or both. Two children pressed against her. A girl of maybe 8, rail-thin with eyes too old for her face. A boy younger, perhaps 5, who clutched a cornhusk doll with the fierce protectiveness of a child who owned nothing else. They were eating potato peelings, not quickly, not desperately, carefully, as if they'd learned to make even garbage last. Ethan's hand went to his hip, an old reflex, though he wore no sidearm these days. His scarred fingers, the right hand missing half the ring finger, the left bearing a twisted burn from shoulder to wrist, flexed against empty air. 3 years he'd lived outside Sweetwater, speaking to no one, asking nothing, offering less. 3 years of penance for things that still woke him gasping in the dark. He should walk away. That was the bargain he'd made with himself when he came to this territory. No connections, no complications, no more lives in his hands. The little boy looked up then, directly at Ethan. There was no plea in those eyes, no hope, just the flat acknowledgement of being seen, and the certain knowledge that being seen changed nothing. Ethan's boots were moving before he'd made the decision. "Ma'am." The woman's head snapped up, and for a moment pure terror flooded her face. She pushed the children behind her body becoming a shield even as her legs trembled with the effort of standing. "We're not causing trouble." Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "We'll move on. Please. We're not causing trouble." "I can see that." Ethan kept his distance, his voice deliberately soft. "Horses and frightened people. You approached both the same way, slow, steady, no sudden movements. When did you last eat? Real food, I mean, not scraps." The woman's throat worked. She didn't answer. 3 days. The little girl's voice was clear, matter-of-fact. "We had hardtack 3 days ago. A miner gave it to us before Mama said we had to leave the camp." "Lily, hush!" The woman's hand found the girl's shoulder, but there was no strength in the grip. Ethan studied them, the shadows beneath their eyes, the way they swayed slightly, even standing still, the boy's distended belly that spoke of prolonged hunger. His jaw tightened. "My ranch is 2 miles north of town. I've got stew on the stove that'll go to waste if someone doesn't eat it. Got a bunkhouse that's warmer than this alley." He paused, reading the fear and calculation in the woman's eyes. "No conditions. No obligations. Just food and shelter until you figure out your next move. We can't pay you. Didn't ask you to." "I don't—" The woman's voice cracked. "I can't offer you anything." The implication hung in the cold air between them. Ethan felt something dark and familiar twist in his gut, the same disgust he'd felt watching officers trade favors for whiskey during the war, watching power corrupt every decent thing it touched. I'm offering you a meal and a warm place to sleep, ma'am. Nothing else. Nothing more. He met her eyes directly, let her see the truth there. I'm not that kind of man. She studied him for a long moment. This stranger with the ruined hands and the careful distance, whose face bore its own map of suffering. Whatever she saw there must have spoken louder than words, because her shoulders sagged slightly, the rigid terror easing into exhausted resignation. Why? She whispered. Because I can. Ethan turned toward his horse, and because no one's watching. The honesty of it seemed to decide her. She gathered the children close, and together they followed him out of the alley. Morrison's had customers. 3 townswomen in their Sunday dresses despite it being Thursday, a rancher arguing about the price of nails, 2 men playing checkers by the stove. Every conversation stopped when Ethan walked through with the woman and children in his wake. Ethan Cole! Morrison himself stepped forward, his florid face arranged in false concern. Those aren't your people. You don't want to get involved. I'm buying supplies, Walter, not asking permission. That woman's trouble. Her husband died owing debts all over this territory. Victor Crow's got legal claim to their... Victor Crow doesn't own people. Ethan's voice stayed level, but something in it made Morrison step back. Now, I need 20 pounds of flour, 10 of beans, coffee, sugar, and salt pork. Add it to my account. I can't sell to her. Mr. Crow said, "You're selling to me. What I do with my supplies is my business." The silence in the mercantile was absolute. Ethan could feel eyes on his back, judgment, curiosity, calculation. In 3 years, he'd spoken more words in this moment than in all his previous visits combined. He'd been invisible, and now he'd made himself seen. No going back now. Morrison bagged the supplies with shaking hands. The woman stood behind Ethan, the children pressed against her legs, all 3 of them barely breathing. When they walked out into the cold afternoon, Ethan loaded the supplies onto his horse and gestured to the woman. "You can ride. I'll walk with the children." "I couldn't. It's 2 miles, and they're already exhausted. You're swaying on your feet." He lifted the boy before she could protest, settling him against his chest. The child weighed almost nothing, all bones and air. "What's your name, son?" "Thomas." The boy's voice was a whisper. "Thomas Hale." "I'm Ethan." He looked to the girl. "And you?" "Lily Hale." She took his offered hand with grave formality. "That's our mama, Clara Hale. Our papa was James Hale, but he died in the mine." "Lily." Clara's voice held warning, but also defeat. You couldn't stop children from speaking truth. They walked through town in silence, a strange procession that drew stares from every window and doorway. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his pace slow enough for Lily's short legs, his arms steady around the boy who'd fallen asleep against his shoulder almost immediately. The ranch appeared as the sun touched the western mountains. A simple cabin, a barn that had seen better days, corrals empty except for 2 horses and a milk cow. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. No decoration, no softness, just function and survival. "It's not much," Ethan said, and realized he felt embarrassed, which was a feeling he'd thought long dead. "It's shelter." Clara slid from the horse with visible effort. "That's more than we've had." Inside, the cabin was as spare as its exterior suggested. A main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, shelves lined with practical supplies. But it was clean, and the fire burned warm, and when Ethan ladled stew into bowls, the smell alone made Thomas whimper. "Slow," Ethan warned, setting the bowls on the table. "Your stomachs aren't used to rich food. Take small bites. Wait between them." He'd seen what happened when starving soldiers gorged themselves. The memory of their suffering made his voice firm. Clara fed the children with shaking hands, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched them eat. She barely touched her own bowl, as if the act of feeding them was sustenance enough. "Eat," Ethan said quietly. "You're no good to them if you collapse." She obeyed mechanically, and Ethan turned away, busying himself with stoking the fire, giving them privacy for their tears and their relief. When he finally sat down with his own bowl, the children had finished and were leaning against their mother, their eyes already heavy. "The bunkhouse has 2 beds and a stove," Ethan said. "I'll get it warmed up. You'll sleep there tonight." "Where will you sleep?" "Here, like always." "We can't take your beds." You're not. Those beds haven't been used in 3 years. Dust and mouse droppings don't need comfort. He stood, collecting the empty bowls. There's water in the pitcher for washing. Take what you need. Outside, he walked to the small structure behind the barn that had once housed ranch hands back when this place ran cattle. Now it sat empty, a monument to all the things Ethan had left behind. He lit the stove, shook out the blankets, and swept away 3 years of neglect with quick, efficient movements. When Clara came to inspect it, the children already half asleep in her arms. Her eyes were dry but red-rimmed. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. Ethan looked at her. This woman who'd been sorting through garbage to feed her children, who'd lost everything but refused to beg, who asked why instead of simply taking because she'd learned to fear the cost of kindness. "Because I have a choice," he said simply, "and so do you. You can stay as long as you need to. No strings, no obligations, just rest and food and time to heal. People will talk. Let them. Mr. Crow will come. Let him." Something shifted in Claire's expression, a cautious, fragile thing that might have been hope or might have been the last ember of strength before total collapse. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan nodded and left before she could see the way his hands shook, before she could know that every word he'd spoken had cost him. Because 3 years of silence had been easy, and this, connection, responsibility, caring, was harder than any battle he'd survived. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, as always. He made coffee, fried bacon and eggs, and was setting the table when he heard small footsteps on the porch. Thomas appeared in the doorway, the cornhusk doll clutched to his chest, his eyes enormous. "Mama said I should ask before coming in." "You can come in." Ethan pulled out a chair. "Hungry?" The boy nodded and climbed into the seat, his feet dangling well above the floor. Ethan served him, watching as Thomas took careful, measured bites, following the previous night's instruction even now. "Your doll have a name?" "Cornflower." Thomas touched the doll's head gently. "Papa made her, before the mountain fell down." Ethan's chest tightened. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man." "Mama cries when we talk about him." Thomas spoke with the blunt honesty of children. "So we try not to, but I don't want to forget." "Then don't. Remember him. Talk about him. The people we lose deserve to be remembered." Thomas considered this, his small face serious. Then he held out the doll. "Do you want to hold Cornflower?" It was offered with the gravity of a sacred trust. Ethan took the doll carefully, noting the neat stitches, the careful construction. A man who'd take time to make something beautiful for his child while working a brutal mine. Yes, that was someone worth remembering. "Your papa had skilled hands," Ethan said, returning the doll. "That's fine work." Clara appeared in the doorway then, Lily behind her, and the fear that flashed across her face when she saw Thomas sitting with Ethan made his stomach turn. How many times had kindness been a trap? How many promises had been broken? "He was hungry," Ethan said simply. "There's more." The meal was quiet, marked by the careful sounds of eating and the crackle of fire. When they finished, Clara began gathering the plates, but Ethan shook his head. "I'll do it. You should rest." "I can't just sit idle." "We should earn our keep. You're healing. That's work enough." Ethan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "When you're stronger, if you want to help with chores, we can talk about it, but not today. Not yet." He could see her struggle, pride warring with exhaustion, the need to prove worth against the desperate relief of being allowed to simply stop. "There's a trunk in the bunkhouse," Ethan said. "It has clothes He paused, the words catching. "Clothes that might fit you and Lily. Take what you need, burn what doesn't fit." "Whose clothes?" Clara asked quietly. "Doesn't matter, they're just taking up space now." But it did matter, and they both knew it. The careful way he didn't say, "my wife," didn't say, "my daughter," spoke volumes about the grief he carried. Clara nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. Two people who'd lost everything, standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out how to keep breathing. The days fell into rhythm. Ethan worked his land, mending fences, tending his small herd, splitting wood for winter. Clara slowly regained strength, and with it, the ability to move without pain, to think beyond simple survival. The children explored the ranch with careful wonder, as if afraid too much joy might shatter this fragile safety. A week passed, then two. Ethan found himself listening for their voices. Thomas's questions, Lily's serious observations, Clara's quiet humming as she mended clothes or prepared meals she insisted on making despite his protests. The cabin, so long silent, carried the sound of life again, and Ethan discovered that the ache it caused wasn't entirely pain. Sometimes it was almost like hope. But hope in Wyoming Territory, 1878, was a dangerous thing, especially when powerful men had decided you'd taken something that belonged to them. Victor Crow arrived on a cold Tuesday afternoon with 5 men at his back. Ethan saw them coming from half a mile away, riders moving with the casual arrogance of men who'd never been told no. He walked to the cabin where Clara was teaching Lily to knead bread, and his voice cut through their laughter. "Take the children to the back room. Don't come out until I say." Clara's hand stilled. "Who is it?" "Doesn't matter. Go." But she looked out the window and went pale. "It's him. It's Crow." "I know. Take the children. Now." She obeyed, gathering Thomas and Lily with quick efficiency, her face set in hard lines. As she passed Ethan, she whispered, "He'll kill you. He killed James. He'll kill you too." "Maybe." Ethan checked the rifle above the door, made sure it was loaded. But not today. He stepped onto the porch as the riders pulled up. Victor Crow sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory. A tall man in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing a wool coat that cost more than most families earned in a year. His face was handsome in the way of men who'd never known hardship, his eyes cold and calculating. "Ethan Cole." Crow's voice carried easy authority. "We haven't been formally introduced. I'm Victor Crow. I own the Crow Mining Consortium, most of the land between here and Laramie, and a few other enterprises you don't need to know about." "I know who you are." Ethan stayed on the porch, his hand resting casual-like on the post, close to the rifle leaning just inside the door. "Then, you know I don't appreciate people taking my property. I don't have any property of yours. The woman, the children, they belong to me." The words hung in the air like poison. Around them, Crow's men shifted in their saddles, hired guns, every one of them, with dead eyes and quick hands. "People don't belong to other people," Ethan said softly. "War settled that question." "The war settled that question for slaves," Crow corrected, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But debts are different. James Hale died owing me $300 in company scrip. His widow and children are collateral on that debt. Company scrip isn't legal tender. You can't collect real debt with fake money. I can collect however I see fit, and right now I see fit to take back what's mine." Crow gestured to his men. "Bring them out." The men started to dismount. Ethan's hand closed around the rifle. "Take one more step toward my door and I'll put a bullet through the first man who tries." The men froze. Crow's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. "You're willing to die for a woman who isn't yours? For children who aren't yours?" "I'm willing to die defending my property from trespassers." Ethan raised the rifle slightly. "And you're trespassing. This is my land. They're my guests. You have no legal claim here." "I have the only claim that matters: power, money, influence." Crow leaned forward in his saddle. "You're nobody, Cole, a squatter on a failed ranch, hiding from whatever shame drove you here. You think you can stand against me?" "I think I can shoot 5 men before they reach my door. I think that rifle shot will carry to the Johnson place, and they'll come running. I think the sheriff will have questions about why Victor Crow and his hired killers came to murder a man on his own property." Ethan's voice stayed level, almost conversational. "I think you're used to people being afraid of you, but fear only works when there's something left to lose." The truth of it settled over the yard like snow. Ethan had nothing, no family, no future, no reason to back down. He was the most dangerous kind of man, one with nothing to protect except the choice he'd made. Crow studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "You're right. Today's not the day for this." He gathered his reins. "But understand something, Cole. Those people are mine. The debt is real, and the law in this territory answers to me. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Maybe. But every day they're here is a day they're not with you. I'll take that." Crow turned his horse. Before riding away, he looked back. "You know what happened to James Hale? He thought he could stand against me too. They found him crushed under 2 tons of rock in a tunnel that mysteriously collapsed just after he made noise about finding a silver vein. He paused. Accidents happen in mining country, Cole. They happen on ranches, too. The threat was explicit, undeniable. Ethan met it with steady eyes. Come back here again, and we'll see whose accident happens first. They rode away in a cloud of dust and suppressed violence. Ethan stood on the porch until they disappeared over the ridge, his hands white-knuckled on the rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he finally turned back to the cabin, Clara stood in the doorway. She'd heard everything. He'll come back, she said, and next time he'll bring more men, or the sheriff, or he'll wait until you're gone, and I know. Then why? Her voice broke. Why make yourself a target? We'll leave. Tonight. We'll disappear. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Ethan set the rifle back above the door. 3 years I've lived here telling myself I earned my isolation, that I deserved this emptiness, that the best thing I could do was stay away from people because everyone I ever cared about ended up dead. He looked at her, this woman who'd lost everything but still fought to protect her children, and felt something crack open in his chest. But you and your children were eating garbage, and the whole town just walked by. And I realized that silence isn't penance. It's just another way of letting evil win. Tears streamed down Clara's face. He killed my husband. He'll kill you too. Maybe. But at least I'll die knowing I made a choice. That I stood up when it mattered. Ethan's voice gentled. You don't owe me anything, Clara. If you want to leave, I understand. I'll give you supplies, money for a stage to Denver or California, or wherever you want to go. But if you stay, I promise you this. As long as I'm breathing, Victor Crow doesn't touch you or those children. She stared at him, this scarred, quiet man who'd stepped out of isolation to become a shield against the darkness that had swallowed her whole life. Then she straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and nodded. We'll stay, but not as charity. We stay as partners. She held out her hand. You protect us from Crow. I'll help you work this ranch, make it something worth fighting for. Deal? Ethan looked at her offered hand, calloused from work, trembling slightly but steady in its intent. He took it, felt the strength there beneath the fragility. Deal. Outside, clouds gathered over the mountains. Winter was coming, and with it, the certainty of violence. Victor Crow didn't make empty threats, and the law in Wyoming territory served whoever paid its salary. But inside the cabin, Thomas was asking Lily to read him a story, and Clara was setting the table for supper, and Ethan Cole, who'd spent 3 years as a ghost, felt something he'd thought the war had killed forever. He felt alive. The first snow came 3 days later, soft and silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Ethan woke to the muffled quiet that only fresh snowfall brings, and when he stepped outside, the world had transformed into something clean and white and deceptively peaceful. His breath clouded in the frozen air as he made his way to the barn, his boots leaving the first tracks across virgin snow. Clara was already there, milking the cow with practiced hands. She'd wrapped herself in one of the coats from the trunk, his wife's coat, though neither of them spoke of it, and her fingers moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of farm work. You're up early, Ethan said, reaching for the pitchfork to muck out the stalls. Couldn't sleep. Clara's voice was steady, but he could hear the tension beneath it. Every sound makes me think it's them coming back. They won't come in snow, too easy to track, too hard to explain if something goes wrong. Ethan spread fresh hay with economical movements. Crow's smart. He'll wait for better conditions. That doesn't make me feel better. Wasn't trying to make you feel better, just telling you the truth. He paused, leaning on the pitchfork. Truth is all we've got right now. Clara finished milking and stood, carrying the pail with both hands. In the dim light filtering through the barn's cracks, her face looked carved from the same pale stone as the snow outside. Thomas asked me last night if we were safe here. I didn't know what to tell him. What did you say? I said we were safer than we've been in a long time. She met his eyes. Was I lying? Ethan considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn door. No, you weren't lying, but safe is relative. We're safer than you were eating scraps in an alley. We're not as safe as we'd be if Crow didn't exist. Somewhere in between is where we live now. That's a hard place to raise children. Every place is hard to raise children when powerful men decide they own the world. Ethan took the milk pail from her. But at least here, they've got warm beds and full bellies while we figure out what comes next. They walked back to the cabin together, their footprints parallel in the snow. Inside, the children still slept, curled together under quilts in the small room that had become theirs. Clara moved to start breakfast, but Ethan shook his head. Sit. I'll do it. You've been running yourself ragged. I need to stay busy. When I stop moving, I start thinking, and when I start thinking, her voice caught. You remember. Ethan set the pail on the counter and reached for the coffee. I know. I spent 3 years staying busy for the same reason. What made you stop? The question hung between them, weighted with more than curiosity. Ethan poured water into the pot, measured coffee with careful precision, and finally answered. I didn't stop. You just gave me something worth being busy for besides running from ghosts. Clara's breath hitched, but before she could respond, Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, cornflower clutched in one hand. It snowed, the girl announced with wonder. It did. Ethan gestured to the window. Want to see? Lily pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Papa used to say snow was the earth putting on its Sunday dress. Your papa was a poet. Ethan cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the warm kitchen. He was a miner, Lily corrected seriously, but he said pretty things sometimes. Mama says I remember him wrong, that I'm making him better than he was. But I don't think so. I think he was just good. Clara turned away, her shoulders tight, and Ethan understood. Grief was a strange thing. It made you question your own memories. Wonder if the dead had been as wonderful as you remembered, or if loss had painted them in colors too bright to be real. I think, Ethan said carefully, that people can be both good and flawed at the same time. Your papa probably made mistakes like everyone does. But if he made you and your brother feel loved, if he said pretty things and built cornhusk dolls, then those memories are true too. Lily considered this with the solemn intensity of the very young. Did you have someone who died? Lily! Clara's voice was sharp. That's not a polite question. It's all right. Ethan plated the eggs, added bacon, set food on the table. Yes, I did. My wife and daughter. Cholera took them while I was away during the war. Did you get to say goodbye? No. We didn't either. They wouldn't let Mama see Papa after the mountain fell. They said he was too broken. Lily climbed into her chair, accepting the fork Clara handed her. Do you think they're together now? All the people who died? Ethan thought about meaningless platitudes, about the easy lies adults told children to soften the edges of death. But he'd promised himself truth, and Lily deserved better than comfort wrapped in deception. I don't know. I'd like to think so. But whether they are or aren't, the love you carry for them is real. That doesn't die. Lily nodded, satisfied, and began eating. Thomas emerged moments later, drawn by the smell of food, and breakfast became a quieter affair punctuated by the small sounds of family, requests for salt, murmured thanks, the clink of forks on plates. After the meal, Ethan bundled the children in their warmest clothes and took them outside to experience their first snow at the ranch. They made angels in the drifts behind the barn, threw snowballs with terrible aim, and laughed with the kind of wild joy that only children could summon from simple pleasures. Clara watched from the cabin window, and when Ethan glanced back, he saw tears on her face. But she was smiling too, and he understood. This was what Crow had stolen, not just security or stability, but the simple right to watch your children play without fear. They spent the morning doing chores, Ethan teaching Thomas how to scatter feed for the chickens, Lily helping Clara gather eggs, all of them working together to dig paths through the snow. By midday, they were exhausted and rosy-cheeked, and the cabin felt warmer than the fire alone could account for. That afternoon, while the children napped, Clara approached Ethan, where he sat mending a bridle. I need to tell you something about James, about what happened before he died. Ethan set down his work. You don't owe me explanations. Maybe not, but you deserve to know what you've stepped into. Clara sat across from him, her hands twisting in her lap. James wasn't a perfect man. He drank sometimes, more than he should. He had a temper, but he loved us, and he worked himself half to death trying to provide. Most men aren't perfect. He found something, in the mine, about a month before he died. Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. A vein of silver so rich it glittered in lamplight like stars. He showed me a piece once, brought it home wrapped in his handkerchief, made me promise not to tell anyone. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He filed a claim? He tried, but claims have to go through the mining office, and the mining office is run by Crow's men. James said they'd just steal it if he went through proper channels. So he was gathering evidence, documenting everything, planning to take it to the territorial governor in Cheyenne. Clara's hands clenched into fists. 3 days before he was supposed to leave, the tunnel collapsed. They said it was an accident, faulty timbering, just bad luck. But James checked those timbers every morning. He was careful about safety. You think Crow found out and had him killed? I don't think. I know. Clara pulled something from her pocket, a small leather journal, worn and water-stained. I found this in James's things after he died. It's his notes, survey measurements, mineral samples, dates, and times. Everything needed to prove the vein exists and that he found it first. Ethan took the journal carefully, flipping through pages of cramped handwriting and careful sketches, maps of tunnel systems, calculations of ore quality, witness statements from other miners who'd seen the strike. It was damning evidence, if anyone cared to look. Why didn't you take this to the law? The sheriff is Crow's cousin. The judge takes bribes. The territorial marshal is 300 miles away and only comes through twice a year. Clara's voice was flat with learned helplessness. I tried. I went to the mining office, demanded an investigation. They laughed at me, called me a hysterical widow, said grief had made me delusional. Then Crow showed up at our company house with papers saying we owed debts we'd never incurred, gave us 3 days to pay or leave. And when you couldn't pay, he sent men to ensure we left with nothing. They took our furniture, our clothes, even Thomas's toys, said it was all collateral against the debt. Clara's voice cracked. We had nowhere to go, no family, no money, no way to fight back. So we ran, lived in mining camps, slept in alleys, ate whatever we could find. I kept the journal hidden in my dress, thinking someday I'd find someone who'd listen, but nobody listens to desperate women with wild accusations. Ethan studied the journal, his mind working through the implications. This wasn't just about protecting Clara and her children anymore. This was about murder, theft, corruption. This was about a powerful man who'd killed to steal another man's discovery and would kill again to keep it hidden. We need to get this to someone who matters, someone outside Crow's reach. There is no one outside his reach, not in this territory. Then we go beyond the territory, Denver, maybe even Washington. Ethan closed the journal, handed it back. But first we need proof beyond just James's notes. We need evidence that links Crow directly to the murder and the theft. How? We can't even get near the mine without Crow's men stopping us. No, but information moves, miners talk. Someone knows something. Someone always knows something. Ethan stood, pacing the small room. The men who worked with James, the ones who might have seen or heard things before the collapse. Do you know any of them? Some, but they're all still working for Crow. They won't risk their jobs, their lives, to help a dead man's widow. Maybe not for a widow, but for cash? Ethan went to a loose board in the floor, pried it up, and pulled out a metal box. Inside were gold coins, carefully saved. I've got $300 here, money I've been saving for... He stopped, the words catching. For what? For a future that didn't exist anymore? Doesn't matter. We use it to buy information. Someone will talk if the price is right. Clara stared at the money, then at him. You'd spend your savings on this? On us? I'd spend it on justice. There's a difference. Justice doesn't feed you through winter. Justice doesn't rebuild a life. No, Ethan agreed, but living without it eats you alive from the inside. I watched good men die for nothing during the war, watched officers pocket money meant for supplies while soldiers starved. I swore if I ever had a choice to stand against that kind of corruption again, I'd take it. He met her eyes. This is that choice. Clara's throat worked. When she spoke, her voice was rough with emotion. James used to say that most people are cowards, that they see wrong and look away because fighting costs too much. He said it didn't make them evil, just human. She took a shaking breath. But you're not looking away, even though it could cost you everything. Maybe I'm just tired of being a coward. You're not. I am. Was. Ethan sat down again, suddenly exhausted. I came here to hide, to live quiet and small, because I couldn't bear the weight of caring about anything. Your family was eating garbage, and I almost walked away. Almost decided it wasn't my problem. His scarred hands clenched. The only brave thing I've done in 3 years was deciding not to. Claire reached across the table and covered his damaged hand with hers. The touch was gentle, careful of the scars, but firm. Sometimes the bravest thing is just showing up. You showed up, Ethan. That matters. They sat like that for a moment, two broken people holding on to each other's wreckage, trying to build something from the ruins. Then Thomas called from the other room, asking for water, and the spell broke. That evening, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Clara made plans. They'd start with the miners who'd worked James's shift, the men who'd been closest to the collapse. Ethan would go into town, careful and casual, buying drinks and asking questions that seemed innocent but weren't. Clara would write down everything she remembered from James's last weeks: conversations, strange visitors, changes in routine. "It's dangerous," Clara said. "If Crow finds out you're asking questions, let him find out. Maybe it'll make him nervous. Nervous people make mistakes. Nervous people also kill to protect their secrets." "I know." Ethan checked his rifle for the third time that night. "That's why we're careful. That's why we don't do anything stupid. But we can't just sit here waiting for him to come back with more men and a better plan." Clara nodded slowly. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow. I'll ride into town, see what I can learn. You stay here with the children, keep the rifle close. Don't open the door for anyone but me. And if you don't come back—" The question was blunt, practical. Ethan appreciated her for asking it. "If I'm not back by dark, you take the children, take my horse, and you ride for the Johnson Ranch. Tell them what happened. They're good people. They'll help you get to Denver or beyond." He pulled out a small leather pouch, pressed it into her hands. "This is enough for stage fare and supplies. Don't argue, just take it." Claire's fingers closed around the pouch. "I'm not going to lose someone else to Crow." "You're not going to lose me." Ethan said it with more confidence than he felt. "I survived 3 years of war. I can handle some questions in a saloon." But they both knew that war and corruption were different beasts, and only one of them fought with rules. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the snow glittering under a hard sun. Ethan saddled his horse while Clara packed him food wrapped in cloth: bread, cheese, dried meat. The children stood on the porch, watching with solemn eyes that understood more than they should. "You're coming back, right?" Thomas asked, clutching cornflour. "I'm coming back." Ethan crouched to the boy's level. "I promise." Papa promised too, then he didn't. The words hit like bullets. Ethan looked at this child who'd learned too young that promises could be broken, that the world was cruel and adults were fragile. He could offer platitudes, easy reassurances that meant nothing, or he could offer truth. "Your papa didn't break his promise on purpose. Sometimes the world breaks promises for us." Ethan touched the boy's shoulder. "But I'm going to try my hardest to keep mine." "That's all any of us can do, try our hardest." Thomas nodded, satisfied with honesty over false comfort. Lily stepped forward and handed Ethan something, a small, smooth stone, gray and unremarkable. "For luck," she said. "Papa carried one. Maybe it'll work better for you." Ethan pocketed the stone, feeling its weight settle against his chest like a talisman. Then he mounted his horse, nodded to Clara, and rode toward Sweetwater. The town looked different in daylight, without the urgency of protecting hungry children. Ethan saw it now for what it was: a collection of buildings barely holding back the wilderness, populated by people trying to survive in a place where power flowed from gold and silver and the willingness to do violence. He tied his horse outside the Silver Dollar Saloon and stepped into the dim, smoky interior. A dozen men occupied the space, some playing cards, others drinking alone, all of them with the worn look of men who work dangerous jobs for poor pay. Ethan ordered whiskey and carried it to a corner table, settling in to watch and listen. Patience was a hunter's virtue, and he'd learned it well during the war. You didn't rush information. You let it come to you. After an hour, a man approached, middle-aged, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, with the gray pallor of someone who spent too much time underground. "You're the one who took in Clara Hale," the man said without preamble. "I am." "That's either brave or stupid. Crow doesn't forget people who cross him." "So I've heard." Ethan gestured to the empty chair. "You worked with James?" The man hesitated, then sat. Might have, might not have. Depends on who's asking and why. Ethan pushed a gold coin across the table. Someone who wants to know what really happened in that tunnel. The coin disappeared into the man's pocket with practiced speed. He leaned back, his eyes scanning the room to make sure no one was paying attention. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Name's Patterson. I was working the shift before the collapse, helping James shore up timbers in the new tunnel. He paused, took a long drink. He was excited that week, kept talking about how things were going to change, how he'd finally be able to give his family a real life. Showed me a piece of ore that was nearly pure silver. Said he'd found a vein that would make him rich. Did he file a claim? Tried. But Turner at the mining office, he's Crow's man through and through. James said Turner told him the vein was on company land, that any discovery belonged to Crow Consortium. Patterson's jaw tightened. James said that was a lie, that he'd checked the surveys 3 times. The vein was on unclaimed territory, and he had the documents to prove it. What happened next? James said he was taking everything to Cheyenne, going straight to the territorial office. He was supposed to leave on a Wednesday. Patterson met Ethan's eyes. On Tuesday, the tunnel collapsed, took out the whole section where James had been working. 20 tons of rock came down like someone had triggered it, deliberate. You think it was sabotage? I don't think, I know. Those timbers were solid. I checked them myself that morning. Someone weakened them after the shift change, then triggered the collapse when James went back in alone to get his survey equipment. Patterson's voice went rough. They left him down there for 6 hours before they started digging. By the time they pulled him out, wasn't enough left to fill a coffin properly. Ethan felt rage settle cold and heavy in his chest. You tell anyone this? Who would I tell? Sheriff's Crow's cousin. Judge takes bribes. And I've got a wife and 3 kids who need me to keep working. Patterson stood abruptly. I've said too much already. You seem like a decent man, Cole, so I'll give you some advice. Take that woman and her children and run. Get as far from Sweetwater as you can. Crow's already killed 1 man over that silver. He won't hesitate to kill another. I appreciate the warning, but you're not going to take it. Patterson shook his head. Then you're a fool. A brave fool, maybe, but still a fool. He walked away, leaving Ethan alone with his whiskey and the cold certainty that Clara had been right. Crow had murdered James Hale in cold blood, and he'd do it again without losing a moment's sleep. Ethan spent 2 more hours in the saloon, buying drinks and collecting fragments of information. 2 more men confirmed Patterson's story with variations. A young miner named Davies admitted he'd seen Crow's foreman near the tunnel hours before the collapse. An old-timer named Hutchins said everyone knew the tunnel had been sabotaged, but knowing and proving were different things, and dead men couldn't testify. By the time Ethan left, he had a picture of systematic corruption, Crow using his position to steal claims, eliminate rivals, and terrorize anyone who challenged his control. The law looked the other way because Crow paid them to. The miners kept quiet because they needed work, and people like James Hale died because they believed justice existed. Ethan rode home as the sun touched the mountains, his mind working through possibilities and dangers. They had testimony now, multiple witnesses who could confirm sabotage. But witnesses could be bought or intimidated, and without physical evidence linking Crow to the murder, any case would collapse under the weight of his money and influence. They needed more. They needed something undeniable. Clara met him at the door, relief flooding her face when she saw him unharmed. The children rushed to hug him, and Ethan found himself surrounded by warmth and worry and the strange comfort of being missed. Did you learn anything? Clara asked once the children were occupied with their supper. Enough to confirm what you suspected. Not enough to prove it in court. Ethan recounted the conversations, watching Clara's face harden with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. So we can't touch him through the law. Not yet, but there's another way. Ethan pulled out the journal again. James documented the vein's location. If we could get to it, extract samples, prove the silver exists where he said it does, we'd have evidence that Crow killed him to steal the claim. The mine's guarded. You'd never get past Crow's men. Not during the day. But at night? Mines don't stop running just because the sun goes down. There's always a skeleton crew, always blind spots. Ethan met her eyes. I can get in. I've done harder things. You could die doing this. I could, but doing nothing guarantees Crow wins. I'm not willing to accept that. He reached across the table, took her hand. I'm not asking your permission, but I'm asking if you can live with the risk. Clara looked at their joined hands, his scarred and rough, hers worn from work and worry. Then she looked at her children, laughing together over their meal, safe and warm for the first time in months. When she spoke, her voice was steel. James died trying to fight back. I won't dishonor that by running now. She squeezed Ethan's hand. We do this. Together. Whatever it takes. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. Inside, they began planning the kind of dangerous, desperate gambit that only made sense when justice had been denied too long and patience had run out. They waited 3 days, watching the mine from a distance, learning the rhythms of shift changes and guard rotations. Ethan rode out each morning under the pretense of checking his fence lines, but his real destination was the ridge overlooking Crow's operation. Through a battered spyglass he'd kept from the war, he mapped every movement, every pattern, every weakness in the security that wrapped around the mountain like iron chains. Clara spent those days preparing. She cleaned and oiled Ethan's rifle, packed supplies for a quick escape if things went wrong, and drilled the children on what to do if strangers came while Ethan was gone. Lily listened with grave attention, but Thomas grew quieter with each passing hour, his small face pinched with worry that no 5-year-old should carry. On the third night, as Ethan checked his gear one final time, Thomas appeared in the doorway of the main room, cornflower clutched tight against his chest. You're going to the mountain, the boy said. Not a question. Ethan crouched down, meeting Thomas at eye level. I am. That's where Papa died. I know. Thomas's lower lip trembled. What if the mountain falls on you, too? Clara moved to intervene, but Ethan held up a hand, keeping his eyes on the boy. This fear deserved honesty, not deflection. I'm going to be very careful. I know which tunnels are dangerous, and I'm not going deep like your papa did, just far enough to prove what he found. Ethan touched the boy's shoulder gently. But you're right to be scared. It is dangerous. And if something happens to me, your mama knows what to do. She'll keep you safe. I don't want you to go. Thomas's voice broke. I don't want another papa to not come home. The words hit Ethan square in the chest. He wasn't this child's father, had no right to that title. But in the economy of a young heart that had lost too much, he'd somehow become something close. The weight of that responsibility settled over him like a physical thing. Come here, Ethan said softly, and Thomas fell into his arms, small body shaking with silent sobs. Ethan held him, this child who'd learned that the world took people away without warning, and made a promise he had no business making. I'm coming back. You hear me? I'm coming back. Over Thomas's head, he met Clara's eyes. She was crying too, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched them. Lily stood beside her mother, one hand gripping Clara's skirt, her expression far too knowing for a child of 8. When Thomas finally pulled away, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the smooth gray stone Lily had given him for luck. He pressed it into Thomas's palm. You hold on to this for me. Keep it safe until I get back, and then you can give it back to me. Deal? Thomas nodded, his fingers closing around the stone like a lifeline. Deal. Ethan stood, shouldering his pack. Clara walked him to the door, and on the threshold she caught his arm. If you don't come back, I will. But if you don't, I need you to know... She stopped, struggling with words. James was a good man, but he was never careful. He charged into things without thinking about consequences. You're different. You think. You plan. You make me believe we might actually survive this. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. Thank you for giving us that. Ethan wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the strange alchemy of these past weeks, how 3 strangers had become something like family, how protecting them had given him a reason to stop hiding from life. But words felt inadequate, so he simply nodded and stepped into the cold night. The ride to the mine took 2 hours through darkness so complete it felt like moving through ink. Ethan let his horse pick the path, trusting the animal's instincts more than his own limited vision. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of men fighting over silver and justice and survival. He left his horse tied in a grove of pine a quarter-mile from the mine entrance and continued on foot. The settlement that had grown up around Crow's operation sprawled across the mountainside. Company housing for workers, a mess hall, supply sheds, and the mine office where fortunes were made on paper while men died in the dark. Lamplight glowed in a few windows, but most structures sat dark and silent. Ethan moved like smoke, using every scrap of cover, every shadow. The war had taught him how to be invisible when visibility meant death. And those lessons came back now, with the muscle memory of survival. He skirted the main buildings, heading for the older tunnel entrances. The ones that predated Crow's expansion, half collapsed and officially abandoned, but still accessible to someone willing to risk unstable ground. The tunnel mouth gaped like a wound in the mountain's face, timber supports sagging under decades of pressure. Ethan lit his lamp, adjusted the flame to minimal light, and stepped into the earth. The temperature dropped immediately, cold seeping through his coat like water. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and claustrophobic, reinforced with timbers that groaned under the mountain's weight. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, a steady rhythm that sounded too much like a clock counting down. Ethan consulted James's journal, comparing the dead man's careful maps to the reality of rock and timber around him. The vein should be in the eastern branch, approximately 300 yards in, accessible through a connection to the newer tunnels. He moved carefully, testing each step, listening for the subtle sounds that meant imminent collapse, the crack of stressed timber, the whisper of shifting stone. 20 minutes in, he heard voices. Ethan doused his lamp and pressed against the tunnel wall, controlling his breathing, making himself part of the darkness. 2 men passed within 10 feet of his position, their own lamps casting wild shadows that danced across rough stone. "Told Crow we should seal this section completely," one man was saying. "Too dangerous to leave open. And I told him it's useful for moving equipment without being seen from the main shaft. You want to explain to him why you're questioning his orders?" The second voice was harsh, impatient. "Just saying, that Hale fellow died right around here. Bad luck keeping it open." Hale died because he stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Wasn't luck, wasn't an accident, was a lesson. The man spat. "Now shut up and help me check these support timbers. Foreman wants them reinforced before the next extraction." They moved past, their conversation fading into echoes and silence. Ethan waited a full 5 minutes before relighting his lamp with shaking hands. The casual confirmation of murder, spoken like discussing the weather, made his blood run cold. These men knew. They'd probably helped. And they lived with it because Crow paid well enough to make conscience a luxury they couldn't afford. He pushed deeper into the mountain, following James's maps through twisting passages that branched and reconnected like veins in a body. Twice more he had to hide from passing workers. Once he stumbled over loose rock and nearly lost his footing on a slope that dropped into darkness so complete his lamp couldn't find the bottom. But finally, in a cramped chamber barely tall enough to stand upright, he found it. The silver vein ran through the rock like a frozen river, catching lamplight and throwing it back in fractured brilliance. Even Ethan, who knew nothing about mining, could see the richness of it, the near pure concentration of ore that meant wealth beyond imagining for whoever controlled the claim. James Hale had died for this, had been crushed under tons of rock so that Victor Crow could steal what he'd discovered. The injustice of it settled in Ethan's chest like a stone. He pulled out the chisel and hammer he'd brought, working quickly to extract samples from multiple points along the vein. The sound of metal on rock seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, each strike echoing through the tunnels like a bell announcing his presence. But he needed enough evidence to be undeniable. Chunks of ore that could be assayed independently, proven to match James's survey notes, demonstrated beyond doubt that the vein existed exactly where the dead man had claimed. He was prying loose the 4th sample when he heard it. Footsteps approaching, multiple sets, moving with purpose rather than patrol randomness. "Check every branch. Someone's been in here tonight." Crow's voice. Unmistakable in its cold authority. Ethan's heart kicked into overdrive. He doused the lamp, stuffed the ore samples into his pack, and moved as quietly as possible toward the rear of the chamber. There had to be another way out. James's maps showed multiple connecting passages, though some were marked as unstable. Light appeared in the main tunnel, growing brighter. Shadows stretched and twisted as men approached. "The timbers here were disturbed recently," another voice said. "Someone's definitely been through." "Find them," Crow's tone allowed for no failure. "If it's Cole, I want him alive. We're going to have a conversation about the cost of interference before I let him join Hale in the ground." Ethan felt along the wall, searching desperately for the secondary passage marked in James's journal. His fingers found a gap, a narrow opening partially concealed by a fallen beam. He squeezed through, scraping skin against rough stone, just as lamplight flooded the chamber he'd abandoned. "Fresh tool marks on the vein," someone shouted. "He took samples." "Then he's still down here. Spread out. Cut off the exits. No one leaves this mountain tonight." Ethan ran, as much as one could run in a tunnel barely wide enough for shoulders, his extinguished lamp swinging from his belt, his pack heavy with stolen evidence. He moved by touch and memory, following the map he'd memorized, knowing that one wrong turn meant dead-ending in a collapse or stumbling into Crow's men. Behind him, shouts echoed through the darkness. Men were entering multiple tunnel branches, coordinating their search with the efficiency of those who knew every inch of the mine. Ethan had minutes at best before they cut off his escape routes. He burst into a larger passage and risked relighting his lamp. The brief flare of illumination showed him a junction, 3 possible paths, all descending deeper into the mountain. James's map indicated the leftmost tunnel connected eventually to an old ventilation shaft, long since abandoned, but potentially climbable. Ethan took it, moving as fast as he dared over uneven ground. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing him to his hands and knees in places, the roof so low it scraped his back. Claustrophobia clawed at his throat, memories of being trapped in collapsed trenches during the war threatening to overwhelm him. He forced the panic down, focused on moving forward, on the promise he'd made to Thomas, on Clara's face when he'd left. He would not die in this mountain. The tunnel opened into a vertical shaft, perhaps 20 feet across, with rusted iron rungs hammered into the stone wall. Above, impossibly far away, a circle of starlight marked the surface. Below, darkness so absolute it seemed solid. Ethan grabbed the first rung and pulled himself up. The metal shrieked under his weight, rust flaking away in red-brown clouds. He climbed steadily, testing each rung before trusting it, knowing that one failure meant a fall that would kill him as surely as Crow's bullets. His pack weighed him down, the ore samples pressing against his spine, but he didn't dare leave them behind. They were worth more than his life. They were justice for a dead man and hope for the living. Halfway up, he heard voices below. Lamplight flooded the base of the shaft. "There, in the ventilation shaft. Shoot him!" Gunfire erupted, bullets sparking off stone, the reports deafening in the enclosed space. Ethan climbed faster, ignoring the screaming protest of his muscles, feeling old iron tear free under his hands. A rung gave way completely, and he hung by one arm for a terrible moment, legs swinging over emptiness, before finding purchase on the next hold. More shots. One passed so close, he felt the air displacement against his cheek. Another punched through his pack, the impact nearly tearing him from the wall. Then he was at the top, hauling himself over the rim of the shaft, collapsing onto frozen ground under a sky full of stars. His lungs burned, his hands were torn and bleeding, but he was alive. He didn't let himself rest. Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran, putting distance between himself and the shaft before Crow's men could climb up or circle around through the main entrance. He crashed through brush, stumbled over rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at his throat. When he finally reached his horse, his legs nearly gave out. He tied the pack to the saddle with shaking hands and mounted, turning the animal toward home. Behind him, shouts echoed across the mountainside as Crow's men emerged from various tunnel entrances, coordinating a pursuit that would come too late. But they knew who he was now, knew what he'd taken. The fragile peace of the last weeks had shattered, and war was coming. Ethan rode through the darkness at a pace that risked his horse's legs and his own neck, but speed mattered more than caution now. He had the evidence, but Crow wouldn't wait for legal proceedings to play out. He'd come with everything he had, and he'd come soon. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when Ethan's ranch came into view. Clara stood on the porch, rifle in hand, her face going slack with relief when she recognized his silhouette. By the time he dismounted, she was running toward him, and then she was in his arms, shaking with reaction. "I heard gunshots echoing across the valley," she gasped. "I thought, I'm here. I'm alive." Ethan held her tight, feeling her heart hammering against his chest. "And I got what we needed." They went inside together. The children were still asleep, exhausted from a night of worry. Ethan spread the ore samples across the table, their silver content unmistakable even to untrained eyes. Clara touched one piece with trembling fingers. "This is what James died for." "This is what we prove Crow murdered him for," Ethan corrected. "This and the testimony we've gathered. Together, it's enough to take to the territorial marshal, enough to demand a real investigation. Crow won't let us get that far. I know, which is why we don't wait for him to come to us. Ethan pulled out James's journal, flipping to a page he'd marked. Your husband documented everything, including the names of other miners Crow has cheated and threatened over the years. 12 men, all with grievances, all afraid to speak out. But if we could gather them, present a united front with evidence. They won't do it. They have families, jobs. Crow owns their lives. Maybe, but we have to try. Ethan met her eyes. Because if we run now, he wins. If we hide, he wins. The only way to beat him is to expose him so thoroughly, so publicly, that even his money and influence can't save him. Clara looked at the ore samples, at the journal, at Ethan's torn and bleeding hands. Then she straightened her shoulders with visible effort. Then we gather the miners. We build a case so strong even corrupt officials can't ignore it. And we make Victor Crow face what he's done. It's going to be dangerous. He's going to come after us harder now. Let him come. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. Clara's voice hardened into something fierce and unbreakable. James tried to fight alone and it killed him. But we're not alone. We have each other. We have evidence, and we have witnesses who are tired of living under Crow's boot. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Pride mixed with fear. Hope tangled with dread. This woman who'd been eating garbage 3 weeks ago was standing before him now like a sword that had been tempered in fire, ready to cut through corruption and lies. All right, he said, we do this together, no matter what comes. No matter what comes, Clara echoed. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Ethan wrote letters to each of the 12 miners James had named, outlining what they'd discovered and requesting a meeting. Clara crafted a detailed account of James's death and Crow's subsequent theft and intimidation. Together they packaged the ore samples with survey notes proving their origin and documentation of James's original claim. By afternoon, a plan had taken shape. They would send word to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, requesting his presence for a formal presentation of evidence. Simultaneously, they'd gather the miners for a public meeting where each could add their testimony to the growing case against Crow. The combined weight of physical evidence, witness accounts, and documentation would be impossible to dismiss or suppress. But first, they had to survive long enough to make it happen. Thomas woke from his nap and immediately sought out Ethan, the gray stone clutched in his small fist. You came back, the boy said, wonder in his voice. I promised, didn't I? Ethan accepted the stone, slipping it back into his pocket where it settled like a talisman against his heart. Lily appeared behind her brother, her sharp eyes taking in Ethan's torn clothes and bandaged hands. You went to the mountain. You got what Papa was looking for. I did. Good. The girl's voice was hard, old beyond her years. Now we make the bad man pay. Lily, Clara's voice was sharp. That's not appropriate. Why not? He killed Papa. He hurt us. He deserves to pay. Lily's small fists clenched. I'm not sorry for wanting that. Ethan crouched down, meeting the girl's fierce gaze. You're right. He does deserve to pay. And we're going to make sure he does, through the law, through justice. But that anger you're carrying, that hate, it'll eat you alive if you let it. I know, I carried it for 3 years, and it nearly destroyed me. Then what am I supposed to do with it? Lily's voice cracked. Where does it go? You use it. You turn it into something stronger than hate. You turn it into the determination to make sure what happened to your family never happens to anyone else. Ethan touched her shoulder gently. Your papa found something valuable, and a greedy man killed him for it. We're going to use what your papa discovered to expose that greedy man, to protect other families, to make the territory safer. That's how we honor your father's memory. Not with hate, but with justice. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back fiercely. You really think we can win? I think we have to try. And trying is how you win, even when the odds are bad. The girl nodded slowly, some of the hardness easing from her young face. She threw her arms around Ethan's neck in a sudden, fierce embrace, and he held her, this child who'd learned too young about loss and injustice and the cruelty of powerful men. That evening, as they sat down to supper, a rider appeared on the horizon. Clara tensed, reaching for the rifle, but Ethan recognized the horse. It's Patterson. From the mine. The miner dismounted slowly, his face grim. Claire kept the children inside while Ethan met him in the yard. I shouldn't be here, Patterson said without preamble. But I owed you a warning. Crow knows you were in the mine last night, knows you took ore samples. He's gathering his men, not just the guards, but hired guns from as far as Denver. 40 men, maybe more. Patterson's voice dropped. He's not planning to arrest you, Cole. He's planning to erase you. You, the woman, the children. Everyone who knows about that vein. Ethan felt ice settle in his veins. When? Tomorrow night. He's giving you today to run, hoping you'll take the bait and disappear. Makes it cleaner if you just vanish rather than forcing a public confrontation. Patterson gripped Ethan's arm. Take the woman and kids and run. Tonight. Don't even pack. Just go. Can't do that. Then you're a dead man. 40 armed men against one? Those aren't odds, that's suicide. Maybe. But there's more than one way to fight. Ethan met Patterson's eyes. You said yourself there are others tired of Crow's control. Miners who've been cheated, threatened, beaten down. What if they had a reason to stand up? What if they had proof that Crow's not invincible? They won't fight. They have too much to lose. They have everything to lose if they don't. Crow's not going to stop with me. He'll keep stealing, keep killing, keep controlling every aspect of life in this territory until someone finally stands against him. Ethan pulled the ore sample from his pocket. We have evidence, we have testimony, we have the truth. All we need are people willing to speak it. Patterson stared at the ore, his expression warring between fear and something that might have been hope. You're asking them to risk their lives. I'm asking them to take their lives back. There's a difference. The miner was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll spread the word. Can't promise anyone will come. Can't promise it'll be enough even if they do, but I'll try. That's all any of us can do. Patterson mounted his horse, paused, and looked back. For what it's worth, Cole, Hale would have liked you. He believed in impossible things, too. He rode away into the gathering dusk, leaving Ethan alone with the weight of what was coming. Tomorrow night. 40 men with guns and no conscience, against one scarred rancher, a widow, and 2 children who'd already lost too much. The odds were impossible. But Ethan had survived impossible odds before. He walked back to the cabin where Clara waited, and together they began preparing for the battle that would decide everything. The cabin felt smaller that night, as if the walls had drawn inward with the weight of what was coming. Clara moved through the rooms with controlled precision, checking ammunition, filling water barrels, preparing bandages from torn sheets. Her hands were steady, but Ethan saw the tremor in her jaw, the way she kept glancing toward the room where the children slept. We should send them away, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The Johnsons would take them, keep them safe while we what? Fight 40 armed men? Ethan loaded his rifle with methodical care. If we lose, Crow won't leave witnesses. The Johnsons are good people, but they won't stand against him. Nobody will. Then what are we doing? What's the point of all this if we're just going to die? Ethan set down the rifle and crossed to where she stood, her shoulders rigid with fear and fury. The point is that we tried. The point is that we didn't let him win without a fight. The point is that maybe, just maybe, we're not as alone as we think. Patterson said the miners wouldn't come. He said he'd spread the word. That's all we can ask. Ethan touched her arm gently. But even if they don't, we still have choices. We can run, take the children and disappear into the territories where Crow's reach doesn't extend. Start over somewhere new. Clara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You don't believe that would work. No, men like Crow don't forget, don't forgive. He'd hunt us for the principle of it, to prove that no one crosses him and lives. Ethan's voice hardened. But I'd rather die running than die kneeling. So if you want to take the children and go, I'll buy you time. I'll hold them here as long as I can. And leave you to face them alone? Clara's laugh was bitter. After everything, after you fed us, protected us, risked your life in that mountain, you think I'd abandon you now? It's not abandonment, it's survival. It's being smart. Smart would have been walking past us in that alley. Smart would have been minding your own business when Crow came the first time. Clara's voice cracked. You stopped being smart the moment you decided we mattered. Don't ask me to be smarter than you. They stood in the lamplight, two people who'd found each other in desperation and built something fragile and fierce from the wreckage of their losses. Outside, wind howled through the valley, carrying the promise of snow and violence. "Then we make our stand here," Ethan said quietly, "together. And we make it count." Clara nodded, blinking back tears. Together. They worked through the night, fortifying what could be fortified. Ethan dragged the heavy oak table to block the main window, leaving gun slits between boards. Clara filled every container with water in case fire became a weapon. They moved ammunition to strategic positions, created fallback points, planned escape routes if the cabin became untenable. At some point past midnight, Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, cornflower dangling from one hand. "You're preparing for a fight," the girl said, her voice matter-of-fact. Clara started to deny it, but Ethan shook his head. "Yes, we are. The bad man is coming. Yes." Lily walked to the table where they'd laid out weapons and supplies. She touched the rifle barrel with one small finger, her expression solemn. "Are we going to die?" "I don't know," Ethan answered honestly. "We're going to try very hard not to, but sometimes trying isn't enough. Papa tried. He still died." "He did. But your papa tried alone, in the dark, where no one could see what happened. We're making sure everyone sees. We're making sure that if we fall, the truth doesn't fall with us." Ethan crouched to her level. "Your mama and I have sent letters to the territorial marshal, to newspapers in Cheyenne and Denver, to every authority we could think of. We've documented everything, the ore samples, the testimony, the evidence of your papa's murder. Even if Crow kills us, the truth is already spreading where he can't reach it. So we've already won?" Hope flickered in Lily's eyes. "We've made sure he can't win completely. That's different, but it's something." Ethan touched her shoulder. "Now go back to bed. Tomorrow's going to be hard, and you need rest." But Lily didn't move. Instead, she looked at her mother with unsettling directness. "Mama, do you love him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara's face went pale, then flushed red. "Lily, we're not. It's okay if you do. I think Papa would want you to be happy. And Ethan makes you smile sometimes. You haven't smiled since Papa died. Not really, not until we came here." The girl's voice was impossibly gentle for someone so young. "I just wanted to know, in case we don't get to talk about it later." Clara's composure cracked. She sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Lily went to her immediately, wrapping small arms around her mother's neck, and Ethan turned away, giving them privacy for their grief and fear and the terrible intimacy of potential last words. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was muffled but clear. "I don't know what I feel. It's too soon, too complicated. Your father has only been gone 4 months. But Ethan—" She paused, gathering herself. "Ethan gave us back our dignity. He made us feel human again. And yes, sometimes when he's gentle with you and Thomas, when he works alongside me like we're partners instead of charity cases, I feel something that might become love if we had time for it to grow." Ethan's throat tightened. He kept his back turned, giving her the illusion of privacy, but every word landed in his chest like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples he couldn't control. "Then we should have time," Lily said firmly. "We should fight and win and have time for all the things we didn't get to do yet." "That's the plan, sweetheart. That's exactly the plan." Lily kissed her mother's cheek and returned to bed, leaving the adults alone with confessions that had been spoken to a child but were meant for each other. Clara wiped her eyes and stood, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. "I shouldn't have said that. Not now, not when—" "I'm glad you did." Ethan finally turned to face her. "I've spent 3 years telling myself I didn't deserve happiness, that everyone I cared about died because I wasn't there to protect them. But you and your children, you walked into my life eating garbage and somehow made me want to be alive again, made me want to fight for something besides my own guilt. That's not love. That's gratitude. Maybe it started as gratitude. But watching you stand up to Crow, seeing you refuse to break even when the world kept trying to crush you, teaching your children to be brave and honest even when it would be easier to teach them to hide." His voice roughened. "That's not gratitude. That's respect. Admiration. And yes, maybe the beginning of something that could be love, if we're lucky enough to survive." Clara crossed the room in 3 quick steps and kissed him. It was brief, fierce, tasting of salt and desperation and hope. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet but steady. Then we survive. Whatever it takes, we survive. Because I'm tired of losing people I care about, and I refuse to lose you before I even get the chance to figure out what this is. Ethan rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her skin against his scarred hands. For a moment, the world narrowed to just this: two people standing together in lamplight, choosing hope over despair, connection over isolation. Then dawn came, gray and cold, and with it the hard work of preparation continued. Ethan rode out at first light to check the approaches to the ranch, looking for signs of Crow's men staging nearby. The valley lay quiet under fresh snow, but he found tracks, multiple horses, moving in coordinated patterns, circling his property like wolves preparing to close on wounded prey. They were already here, watching, waiting for nightfall. He returned to find Clara teaching the children how to reload rifles, her voice calm and patient as she demonstrated the mechanics of survival. Thomas watched with wide, frightened eyes, but Lily's face held grim determination. "If shooting starts, you take Thomas and go to the root cellar," Clara was saying. "You know where the key is hidden. You lock yourselves in and you don't come out until Ethan or I come for you. You understand?" "What if neither of you comes?" Lily asked quietly. "Then you wait until morning and you go to the Johnsons. You give them the packet we prepared. It has money, letters of introduction, instructions for getting you to Clara's sister in Illinois." Clara's voice stayed steady through sheer force of will. "But that's not going to happen. We're going to be fine." "You're lying." Lily's bluntness cut through false comfort. "We might not be fine, but we'll be brave. That's what Papa always said. You can't control what happens, only how you face it." Clara pulled both children into a fierce embrace, and Ethan looked away, checking ammunition for the 10th time, anything to avoid the raw emotion of a mother preparing her children for the possibility of orphanhood. The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Ethan kept watch from the windows, rifle always within reach. Clara prepared food they might not live to eat. The children played quietly, their usual energy muted by the tension that filled every corner of the cabin. Around noon, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge. Then another. By mid-afternoon, Ethan counted 8 men positioned around his property, not attacking, just waiting, making their presence known. 40 men, Patterson had said. Where were the rest? The answer came as the sun touched the western mountains. More riders appeared, but these came from the north, moving in a loose group rather than tactical formation. Ethan raised his spyglass and felt something catch in his throat. Miners. 20, maybe 25 of them, riding workhorses and mules, carrying hunting rifles and mining tools converted into weapons. They were ragged, poorly armed, but they were coming. Patterson led them, his face set in hard lines. Behind him rode Davies, the young miner who'd witnessed Crow's foreman near the collapse site. Hutchins, the old-timer. Men whose names Ethan didn't know, but whose presence spoke to desperation that had finally outweighed fear. They formed a defensive line between the cabin and Crow's positioned men, spreading out to cover the most likely approaches. Patterson dismounted and walked to where Ethan stood on the porch. "Couldn't convince everyone," Patterson said without preamble. "Some were too scared, some thought it was suicide. But these men, they've lost claims, lost wages, lost friends to Crow's greed. When word spread about what you found in the mountain, about the proof that Hale was murdered for his discovery, something broke. They decided they were tired of living on their knees." "You know, this is probably a death sentence," Ethan said quietly. "Yeah. But staying quiet was a death sentence too, just slower. At least this way we die standing for something." Patterson looked at the cabin, at Clara visible through the window with her children. "That woman and those kids, they deserve better than what this territory has given them. We all do. Maybe we can't win, but we can make Crow bleed for his crimes. That's worth something." More riders appeared then, from the south this time. But these weren't miners. Ethan recognized the silver star pinned to the lead rider's coat, the territorial marshal, flanked by 4 deputies and 2 men in suits who had the look of federal investigators. The marshal rode straight to Ethan's porch, his weathered face unreadable. "Ethan Cole?" "That's me." "Marshal William Thornton. Got your letter 3 days ago. Came as fast as the weather allowed." He glanced at the standoff forming around them. Crow's hired guns on one side, desperate miners on the other. Looks like we're just in time to prevent a massacre. Or participate in one, depending on which side you're on. Ethan kept his voice level, not letting hope override caution. Marshals could be bought, just like sheriffs and judges. Thornton's eyes hardened. Son, I've been wearing this badge for 22 years. I've seen corruption, seen good men break under pressure, seen the law twisted to serve power instead of justice. But I've never seen evidence as damning as what you sent me, or samples that match surveys of a murdered miner, testimony from multiple witnesses, documentation of systematic fraud and intimidation. He dismounted, his hand resting on his sidearm. Victor Crow is going to answer for his crimes. That's not a maybe. That's a certainty. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Crow himself appeared, riding at the head of his 40 hired guns, his expensive coat immaculate, his face calm as he surveyed the opposition arrayed against him. He pulled up 50 yards from the cabin, well within speaking range, but far enough to avoid immediate violence. When he spoke, his voice carried the casual authority of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. Marshal Thornton. What a pleasant surprise. I wasn't aware the territorial government had taken an interest in our little mining dispute. This isn't a mining dispute, Crow. It's a murder investigation. Multiple murders, as it turns out, along with fraud, theft, and witness intimidation. Thornton's voice was flat, professional. I'm here to place you under arrest and escort you to Cheyenne for trial. Crow laughed, the sound cold and amused. On what evidence? The ravings of a widow driven mad by grief? The ore samples stolen from my mine by a trespasser? The testimony of malcontents who resent my success? He gestured to his armed men. I see you brought deputies, Marshal. I count 6 lawmen against 40 of my employees. And this is my territory. Every man here works for me, depends on me for their livelihood. You really think you can arrest me in the middle of my own holdings? I think the law doesn't care about your holdings. I think you murdered James Hale and likely others who threatened your illegal claims. I think you've terrorized this territory long enough. Thornton's hand moved closer to his gun. Now you can come peaceful, or you can resist and die where you sit. Your choice. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Crow's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. The miners tightened their grips on rifles. The deputies spread out, creating firing lines. Then Clara stepped onto the porch, James's journal in her hands. You killed my husband, she said, her voice cutting through the charged silence. You killed him because he found silver on unclaimed land, and you wanted it for yourself. You crushed him under tons of rock and left my children fatherless. Then you tried to claim we owed you money, tried to make us your property, and when we escaped, you came after us with threats and guns. Prove it, Crow said coldly. Prove any of it in a court of law. I can. Clara held up the journal. James documented everything, surveys, witness statements, mineral assays. He knew you were watching him, knew you'd try to steal his claim, so he made sure the truth would survive even if he didn't. She looked at Marshal Thornton. This journal, combined with the ore samples Ethan retrieved and the testimony of the miners here, proves that James Hale discovered a silver vein on public land. It proves that Victor Crow knew about it. And it proves that James died in a suspicious collapse the day before he was set to file his claim in Cheyenne. One of the suited men stepped forward. I'm Robert Lansing, Deputy Territorial Surveyor. I've examined the ore samples Mr. Cole provided. They're consistent with the location described in Mr. Hale's survey notes, and that location is indeed on public land, not Crow Mining Consortium property. Any extraction from that vein would be theft of federal resources. The second suited man spoke next. And I'm Thomas Brennan, Territorial Prosecutor. Based on the evidence gathered, I have sufficient cause to charge Victor Crow with murder, fraud, theft of mineral rights, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Marshal, you have my full authority to take him into custody. Crow's face darkened. You're making a mistake, all of you. I have lawyers. I have influence in the Capitol. I have friends who— You have nothing, Ethan said, stepping forward to stand beside Clara. Your mine foreman is already in custody. Patterson convinced him to testify in exchange for immunity. He confirmed you ordered the tunnel sabotaged. He confirmed you knew about James's discovery and ordered it stolen. He's prepared to testify to all of it under oath. It was a bluff. The foreman was still free, still dangerous. But Crow didn't know that, and the flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face was worth the risk. Patterson picked up the thread smoothly. And 12 miners are prepared to testify about other suspicious accidents, other claims that disappeared into your holdings, other men who crossed you and ended up dead or disappeared. You've been running this territory like your personal kingdom for 10 years, Crow. But kingdoms fall, and yours is crumbling right now. For the first time, doubt shadowed Crow's expression. He looked at his hired guns, at the marshal's deputies, at the miners who'd found their courage, and seemed to calculate odds that no longer favored him. You can't prove I ordered anything. I'm a businessman. If my employees committed crimes, that's on them, not me. Your ledgers say otherwise. One of the deputies held up a leather-bound book. We executed a search warrant on your office 3 hours ago. Found detailed records of payments to men for security services that coincided with every suspicious death or disappearance. Found notes in your own handwriting about dealing with the hail problem. Found correspondence with corrupt officials proving you knew exactly what was being done in your name. The ledger. The same one Ethan and Clara had planned to steal but never reached. Someone else had gotten there first. Maybe Patterson. Maybe another miner who'd finally had enough. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Crow's careful documentation of his own crimes had become the weapon that would destroy him. Crow's hand dropped toward his gun. 20 rifles came up in response, held by miners who'd spent years letting injustice slide, but had finally found their line. Marshal Thornton's deputies drew their weapons with professional speed. Even the federal investigators revealed hidden sidearms. Don't, Thornton said quietly. You're already facing the gallows. Don't add dying stupid to your list of sins. For a long moment, the world balanced on the edge of violence. Then Crow's shoulders sagged slightly, and his hand moved away from his weapon. I want my lawyer. You'll get one, after we transport you to Cheyenne for arraignment. Thornton nodded to his deputies, who moved forward with iron shackles. Victor Crow, you're under arrest for the murder of James Hale and others, for fraud, for theft of mineral rights, and for conspiracy to obstruct justice. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you'll want to talk plenty once you realize how much evidence we have. As the deputies clamped shackles onto Crow's wrists, his hired guns shifted uneasily. Their employer was in chains, their paychecks suddenly uncertain. Most had the look of men who fought for money, not loyalty, and money stopped flowing when the man writing checks was headed for prison. Any of you boys want to join your boss in a cell? Just reach for those guns, Patterson called out. Otherwise, I suggest you ride out peaceful-like and find honest work elsewhere. The hired guns exchanged glances, then began peeling away one by one, melting into the growing dusk like snow under spring sun. Within minutes, 40 men had become 4, then 2, then none. Just Crow sitting his horse in shackles, his empire crumbling around him faster than the tunnel that had killed James Hale. Marshal Thornton looked at Clara. Ma'am, I'm going to need you and your children to come to Cheyenne to testify. Your husband's journal will be entered as evidence, and your testimony about Crow's intimidation and threats will be crucial to securing a conviction. How long will the trial take? Clara asked, her hand finding Ethan's. Could be months. Could be longer if Crow's lawyers try to delay. But I promise you this, we'll make sure you have safe lodging and protection throughout. No one's going to hurt you or your children while you're under federal protection. And after? After the trial? Claire's voice held barely controlled fear. If he's acquitted, if his money buys him freedom. He won't be, Brennan interrupted. The evidence is too strong, the witnesses too numerous. But even if by some miracle he walks, the mining consortium is finished. The federal government is seizing his properties pending investigation of mineral rights violations. His political connections are severing ties as we speak. Nobody wants to be associated with a man facing murder charges. Victor Crow is done, whether he hangs or not. Ethan felt Clara's grip tighten on his hand. 3 months ago, she'd been eating garbage behind a mercantile, her children starving, her husband murdered and unavenged. Now she stood watching his killer led away in chains, surrounded by armed men who'd risen from fear to stand with her, backed by federal authorities who'd traveled hundreds of miles based on evidence her husband had died protecting. We won, she whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it less real. You won, Patterson corrected, approaching with his battered hat in his hands. You and Cole. You refused to run when anyone else would have. You stood up when the rest of us were too scared. You gave us a reason to remember we were men, not just Crow's property. He looked at the miners gathered around. "We owe you everything." "You don't owe us anything," Ethan said. "You showed up. You risked your lives and livelihoods. That's more courage than most people ever find." The miners dispersed slowly, talking amongst themselves with the giddy relief of men who'd prepared for death and found survival instead. Marshal Thornton's party made camp nearby, setting guards around Crow to prevent escape or rescue attempts. As full darkness fell, the valley settled into an uneasy peace. Violence narrowly avoided, justice precariously claimed. Inside the cabin, Clara finally allowed herself to collapse. She sat at the table, her head in her hands, her whole body shaking with reaction. The children climbed into her lap despite being too big for it, and she held them with desperate strength. "It's over," she kept saying. "It's really over." But Ethan knew better. The immediate danger had passed, yes. Crow was in custody, his organization scattered, but trials took time, and powerful men had ways of reaching beyond prison walls. Testimony could be intimidated or bought. Witnesses could disappear. Justice delayed was often justice denied. Still, for tonight, they were safe. The children were alive. Clara had seen her husband's killer brought low. That was enough. Later, after Thomas and Lily had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from fear and relief, Ethan and Clara stood together on the porch. Snow had begun falling again, soft and silent, covering the tracks of the day's confrontation with pristine white. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her breath misting in the cold air. "Now you testify. You make sure Crow hangs for what he did. You take back your husband's claim and secure your children's future." Ethan stared out at the darkness. "And I go back to being a rancher who minds his own business." Clara turned to face him, her expression fierce even in the dim light from the cabin windows. "Is that what you want? To go back to being alone?" "No." The admission came easier than Ethan expected. "But what I want doesn't matter. You have a chance now to rebuild your life, to give your children stability and security. You don't need—" "Don't you dare finish that sentence." Claire's voice cut like steel. "Don't you dare tell me what I need. I need someone who sees me as a partner, not a burden. I need someone who treats my children like they matter. I need someone who will fight impossible battles because it's right, not because it's easy." She grabbed his coat, pulling him close. "I need you, Ethan Cole, and my children need you. And if you try to walk away because you think we deserve better, I will hunt you down and drag you back myself." Ethan found himself smiling despite everything, despite the exhaustion and fear and uncertainty that still clouded their future. "That a threat? That's a promise." Clara kissed him, fierce and demanding and full of all the things they hadn't had time to say during the crisis. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet but steady. "So what's your answer? You going back to being alone? Or are you going to stay and see what we can build from all this wreckage?" Ethan thought about 3 years of isolation, of punishing himself for losses he couldn't prevent. He thought about the moment he'd seen Clara and her children eating garbage and made the choice to step forward instead of away. He thought about Thomas's trust, Lily's fierce hope, Clara's unbreakable strength in the face of impossible odds. "I'm staying," he said quietly, "for as long as you'll have me." "Then you're staying forever," Clara said, and pulled him back inside where warmth and family and the fragile beginning of healing waited. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the scars of violence with temporary beauty. And in the distance, riding toward Cheyenne in chains, Victor Crow faced the first night of many where power and money couldn't save him from the consequences of his crimes. Justice, slow and imperfect as it was, had finally come to the Wyoming Territory. The journey to Cheyenne took 4 days through early winter snow that transformed the Wyoming Territory into an endless expanse of white. Marshal Thornton's party traveled with military precision, deputies rotating guard duty around the prisoner wagon where Crow sat in chains, scouts riding ahead to check for ambush, the whole operation moving with the careful efficiency of men who'd learned that complacency killed. Ethan rode alongside the wagon, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats that might still materialize. Clara and the children traveled in a covered wagon driven by one of the federal investigators, bundled against the cold, their faces pale but determined whenever he glanced back to check on them. On the second night, camped in a sheltered canyon with fires burning against the dark, Thomas approached Ethan, where he sat cleaning his rifle. "Is the bad man really going to hang?" the boy asked, his voice small in the vast silence of the wilderness. "If the judge and jury do their jobs, yes. He'll hang for what he did to your father and the others." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his small hands twisted together. "Will that make Papa come back?" The question hit Ethan in the chest like a physical blow. He set down the rifle and pulled Thomas onto his lap, feeling the boy's slight weight, the trust implicit in the way he leaned against Ethan's chest. "No, son. Nothing brings back the people we lose. Justice isn't about resurrection. It's about making sure the person who took them away faces consequences. It's about protecting others from suffering the same way." Ethan's voice was gentle but honest. "Your papa is gone, and that's a wound that'll never fully heal. But making sure Crow pays for killing him, that helps. Not by fixing the past, but by honoring it. Mama says you're going to be part of our family now, after the trial." Thomas looked up, his eyes searching Ethan's scarred face. "Does that mean you'll be my new papa?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. The responsibility of that question, the weight of a child's hope pressed against the knowledge of his own failures, threatened to overwhelm him. He thought of his daughter, dead before he could say goodbye, of all the ways he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve a second chance at fatherhood. "I can't replace your papa," he said carefully. "He was a good man who loved you, and his memory deserves respect. But if you want, I can be someone else who loves you. Someone who'll teach you things and keep you safe and be there when you need me." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "Not a replacement, just someone new who cares about you as much as he did." Thomas considered this with the seriousness of the very young, then nodded slowly. "Okay, that's good." He pulled cornflour from his pocket, the corn-husk doll worn now from constant handling. "Papa made this, but maybe you could teach me how to make things too, so I can remember both of you?" "I'd like that very much." The boy smiled, a real smile that transformed his solemn face into something bright and hopeful, then scampered back to the covered wagon where Clara and Lily waited. Ethan watched him go, feeling something shift in his chest, the old guilt loosening its grip, replaced by something tentative and new that felt almost like forgiveness. Clara appeared beside him a few minutes later, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. "He asked you, didn't he, about being his father?" "He did. I told him the truth. I can't replace James, but I can be someone who loves him. That's all any of us can do. Love the people in front of us as best we can." Clara sat down beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. "James would have liked you, you know. He always said the measure of a man wasn't how he acted when things were easy, but how he stood when everything fell apart. You stood. For us. For justice. For everything he died believing in. I stood because walking away would have killed me slower than any bullet." Ethan took her hand, feeling calluses that matched his own. "You gave me something to fight for besides my own guilt. That's a gift I can't repay." "Then don't repay it. Just stay. Build a life with us. Let that be enough." They sat together in the firelight while snow fell softly around them, and the future stretched ahead full of possibility and fear in equal measure. Somewhere in the prisoner wagon, Victor Crow sat in darkness, his empire reduced to chains and the slow grinding of justice. But here, in the small circle of warmth, two broken people held each other against the cold and chose hope over despair. Cheyenne appeared on the fourth day, a sprawling collection of buildings that served as the territorial capital, full of politicians and lawyers and the machinery of government that turned slowly but with terrible weight when finally set in motion. Marshal Thornton led them through streets crowded with freight wagons and cattle drives, past saloons and shops, and the grand territorial courthouse that dominated the town square. They lodged Clara and the children in a boarding house run by a stern woman named Mrs. Henderson, who took one look at Lily's two old eyes and Thomas's haunted face and declared herself personally responsible for their well-being. Ethan took a room at the hotel across the street, close enough to protect them, but far enough to preserve Clara's reputation until the trial concluded and they could make their relationship official. The trial began 2 weeks later, delayed by defense motions and legal maneuvering as Crow's expensive lawyers tried every trick to suppress evidence or intimidate witnesses. But Marshal Thornton and Prosecutor Brennan had built their case too well, gathered too much documentation, secured too many testimonies for even the cleverest legal tactics to overcome. Ethan sat in the gallery every day, watching as the prosecution methodically dismantled Crow's empire one witness at a time. Patterson testified about the suspicious tunnel collapse and Crow's immediate seizure of James Hale's claim. Davies described seeing the foreman near the tunnel hours before the accident. The foreman himself, granted immunity in exchange for testimony, confirmed that Crow had ordered the sabotage and provided detailed accounts of other murders disguised as mining accidents. The ore samples were entered into evidence, their mineral content analyzed and confirmed to match James's survey notes precisely. The surveys themselves proved the vein lay on public land, making Crow's extraction illegal theft of federal resources. And James's journal, carefully preserved by Clara through months of destitution, provided a paper trail that connected every piece of evidence into an unbreakable chain of guilt. When Clara took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She wore a simple dress borrowed from Mrs. Henderson, her hair pulled back severely, her hands folded in her lap. But her voice was steady as she described James's final weeks, his excitement about the discovery, his fear of Crow's retaliation, his determination to file a legal claim before anyone could steal what he'd found. He knew the risks, Clara said, her eyes fixed on Crow, where he sat at the defense table in expensive clothes that couldn't hide the shackles on his wrists. He told me that powerful men don't give up their power willingly, that challenging Crow might cost him everything. But he said some things were worth the cost. He said our children deserved a future built on honest work, not scraps stolen from the table of corruption. And what happened the day before he was supposed to leave for Cheyenne? Brennan asked gently. The mine collapsed. They said it was an accident, faulty timbering. But James checked those timbers every morning. He was meticulous about safety because he'd seen too many men die from carelessness. Claire's voice hardened. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. And Victor Crow ordered it because my husband found something valuable and wouldn't let it be stolen. Crow's lawyer tried to break her testimony during cross-examination, suggesting grief had clouded her judgment, that she was a scorned woman seeking revenge through false accusations. But Clara met every attack with quiet dignity, answering questions with facts instead of emotion, refusing to be rattled or intimidated. Your husband was in debt to Mr. Crow's company store, was he not? The lawyer pressed. He was not. The debts that appeared after his death were fabricated. James kept careful records of every penny we spent. I have those records, and they show we owed nothing. You claim to have records, but where are they? Can you produce them? Clara pulled a small ledger from her bag, worn and water-stained but meticulously maintained. Right here. Every purchase, every payment, every balance. James was a miner, but he was also educated. He knew how men like your client operated, so he protected us the only way he could, with truth written down where it couldn't be denied. The defense attorney's face went pale as Brennan entered the ledger into evidence, another nail in the coffin of Crow's defense. When Clara stepped down from the witness stand, she walked with her head high, and Ethan saw in her the same strength that had kept her alive through months of destitution, the refusal to be broken, to be made small, to let injustice have the final word. Lily and Thomas were spared from testifying directly, but their written statements describing their mother's treatment after James's death, the seizure of their possessions, and their desperate months of survival were read into the record. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as a prosecutor described children eating garbage while the man who'd murdered their father lived in luxury, protected by corrupt officials who looked the other way because he paid them to. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony and evidence and legal arguments that slowly, methodically built a case so overwhelming that even Crow's expensive defense team couldn't find cracks to exploit. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with a verdict that surprised no one who'd paid attention. Guilty on all counts. Murder, fraud, theft, conspiracy, witness intimidation. The judge, a stern man in his 60s who'd presided over territorial courts for 20 years, showed no mercy during sentencing. Victor Crow, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of crimes that strike at the very foundation of civilized society. You murdered James Hale and at least 3 other men to steal what they had legally discovered. You used your wealth and influence to corrupt officials, intimidate witnesses, and create a system where justice served only your interests. The judge's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. This court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out 30 days hence. May your execution serve as a warning to others who believe power places them above the law. Crow's face went ashen. For the first time since his arrest, genuine fear showed through his carefully maintained composure. His lawyers immediately filed appeals, but everyone in the courtroom knew they were futile gestures. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too heinous, the public outcry too loud for any higher court to overturn the verdict. As marshals led Crow from the courtroom in chains, he looked directly at Clara with eyes full of impotent rage. She met his gaze without flinching, and Ethan saw her lips move in words too quiet for anyone else to hear. But he could read them clearly enough. James won. You lost. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Miners who'd traveled from Sweetwater to witness justice. Townspeople who'd read about the trial in newspapers. Reformers who saw in Crow's conviction a chance to challenge corruption throughout the territory. They erupted in cheers when Clara emerged, surrounding her with congratulations and gratitude, treating her like a hero when all she'd done was refuse to let her husband's murder go unavenged. Patterson pushed through the crowd, his weathered face split in a genuine smile. They're going to name the mine after him, the James Hale Silver Mine. Federal surveyors confirmed the vein is worth over $2 million, and it all belongs to you and your children by right of discovery. You're rich, Mrs. Hale, truly rich. Clara swayed slightly, and Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her. $2 million. A fortune beyond imagining for a woman who'd been eating garbage mere months ago. Enough to give her children every advantage, every opportunity, every comfort. Enough to build a life anywhere she wanted, with or without a scarred rancher who'd stumbled into her story by accident. That night, after the children were asleep and the celebrations had quieted, Clara came to Ethan's hotel room. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lamp, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking about the future," she said without preamble. Ethan's chest tightened. "Clara, let me finish." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I have money now, more than I ever dreamed possible. I could take the children to San Francisco or Boston or anywhere civilized, give them tutors and music lessons and society balls, make them into proper ladies and gentlemen who'd never have to remember eating scraps in an alley." "You should do that. They deserve that." "What they deserve," Clara said fiercely, "is to grow up knowing that courage matters more than comfort, that standing up for what's right is worth more than any amount of money, that family isn't defined by blood or circumstance, but by who stands beside you when everything falls apart." She crossed the room and took his scarred hands in hers. "You stood beside us. You risked everything for people who were nothing to you. And now I'm asking, will you stand beside us for the rest of our lives? Not as a protector or savior, but as a partner, as a husband, as a father to children who've already lost one and can't bear to lose another?" Ethan felt tears burn behind his eyes, the first he'd shed since the war. "I'm a broken man, Clara. I've got nothing to offer but a failing ranch and hands too scarred to hold anything delicate without fear of breaking it. You're the strongest man I've ever known, and these hands—" She raised his damaged fingers to her lips, kissing each scar. "These hands fed my children when they were starving. These hands fought for justice when everyone else looked away. These hands built a home where there was only emptiness. If that's what broken looks like, then give me broken over whole any day. I can't promise I won't fail you. Can't promise I'll always know the right thing to say or do. I don't want promises. I want partnership. I want someone who will face the hard things with me instead of pretending they don't exist. I want someone my children can look up to, someone who will teach them to be brave and honest and kind, even when the world makes those things difficult." Clara moved closer, until they were breathing the same air. "I want you, Ethan Cole, just as you are, broken pieces and all. Because somehow those broken pieces fit perfectly with mine." He kissed her then, deep and desperate and full of all the words he didn't have, all the hope he'd thought died with his first family. When they finally broke apart, both were crying, both were smiling, both were holding on like drowning people who'd found solid ground. "Yes," Ethan whispered. "To all of it. Yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the territorial courthouse, with Marshal Thornton serving as witness and Mrs. Henderson crying into her handkerchief. Lily and Thomas stood beside their mother, both wearing new clothes bought with money that was finally theirs by right rather than charity. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas threw his arms around Ethan's legs and Lily actually smiled, a real smile that transformed her too serious face into that of the child she should have been all along. The hanging took place the next morning. Ethan and Clara didn't attend. They'd seen enough of Victor Crow, and witnessing his death wouldn't bring James back or erase the damage he'd done. Instead, they spent the day preparing for their journey home, packing the wagon with supplies and the surveying equipment they'd need to properly develop the mine that now bore James's name. Patterson and the other miners had stayed in Cheyenne for the execution, and they came to the boarding house afterward with news that Crow had died defiant to the end, cursing the court and claiming he'd been persecuted by jealous inferiors. But his defiance changed nothing. He was dead, his empire dismantled, his crimes paid for as much as crimes ever could be. "Justice isn't perfect," Patterson said, accepting the coffee Mrs. Henderson pressed into his hands. "But it's better than nothing. And what you did, Mrs. Cole, still getting used to that. What you did showed a lot of people that standing up is possible. We're forming a miners' association using James's case as a template for challenging other corruption. You started something bigger than just one trial." "James started it," Clara corrected gently. "I just finished what he began." "Then we'll finish it together. Make the territory a place where men can work honestly without fear of powerful interests crushing them." Patterson stood, tipping his hat. "Safe travels home. And if you ever need anything, you just send word. We owe you everything." The journey back to Sweetwater took a week, slower now with the wagon full of supplies and hope instead of fear. They traveled through a landscape transformed by early spring, snow melting in the valleys, revealing earth ready for planting, the air carrying hints of warmth that promised easier days ahead. Thomas chattered constantly during the trip, his natural childhood exuberance finally freed from the weight of trauma. He asked Ethan endless questions about ranching, about horses, about how things grew and how they worked, and Ethan answered each one with the patience of a man who'd learned that the simple act of being present was itself a kind of miracle. Lily remained quieter, more watchful, but occasionally Ethan caught her smiling at something Thomas said or humming while she helped her mother prepare meals. The child was still there beneath the armor she'd built, and with time and safety, that child might fully emerge again. Clara rode beside him on the wagon seat, her hand often finding his, their fingers intertwining like the roots of two trees growing together into something stronger than either alone. They talked about the future, about developing the mine responsibly, about using the wealth it generated to improve conditions for all the miners, about building a home where their children could grow up knowing love and stability. "I want to expand the ranch," Ethan said one evening as they made camp beneath a sky full of stars. "Not to make more money, we have enough now, but to create work for people who need it. Patterson and some of the others, they're good men who deserve better than working in Crow's old operation." "A partnership, then. The ranch and the mine working together." Clara leaned against his shoulder, watching the fire. "James would like that. He always said wealth should serve the community, not just the person who found it. He was a smart man. He was. And he'd be grateful you're here to help raise his children, to love the wife he left behind." Clara turned to look at Ethan, her eyes reflecting firelight. "I loved James. I'll always love the memory of who we were together. But I love you too, differently, but no less real. Is that wrong?" "No. Love isn't a finite resource that runs out when you give it to more than one person. It grows, expands, makes room for everyone who deserves it." Ethan kissed her forehead gently. "James gave you years of love. I'm grateful for whatever time I get, however it fits alongside your memories of him." They held each other while night deepened around them, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of loss and built something new from the broken pieces. In the tent nearby, the children slept peacefully, their nightmares slowly fading, replaced by dreams of a future that held possibility instead of just survival. When they finally reached the ranch, spring was fully underway. The valley had transformed into a canvas of green and gold, wildflowers blooming across meadows that had been buried under snow when they left. The cabin stood exactly as they'd left it, solid and welcoming. And when they crossed the threshold together as a family, Ethan felt the last of his self-imposed isolation crack and fall away. This was home now. Not the empty structure where he'd hidden from life, but a place filled with laughter and purpose, and the messy, complicated beauty of people learning to love each other. They spent the summer building. Ethan and hired workers expanded the ranch house, adding rooms for the children and a study where Clara could manage the mine's business affairs. They built a proper bunkhouse for the miners who came to work the James Hale silver mine under fair wages and safe conditions. They planted gardens and repaired fences and slowly transformed the property from a hermit's refuge into a thriving homestead. The mine itself was developed carefully, with proper timbering and safety protocols that honored James's memory by ensuring no other miners would die from negligence or greed. Claire insisted on sharing profits with the workers, creating a model that other operations began to emulate. Within a year, the Sweetwater Mining District had transformed from a place of exploitation into one where labor and capital worked in genuine partnership. Patterson became mine foreman, his experience and integrity making him the natural choice to oversee operations. Other miners who'd testified against Crow found work either at the mine or at the ranch, creating a community of people bound together by shared trauma and collective healing. The children thrived. Thomas grew taller, his laughter becoming a constant soundtrack to ranch life. He learned to ride, to mend fences, to do all the small tasks that made a working ranch function. Ethan taught him patiently, and in teaching found his own path to redemption, not by erasing the past, but by building a future that honored both the daughter he'd lost and the son he'd gained. Lily's transformation was slower, but no less profound. She began drawing, filling sketchbooks with images of the ranch and mountains and family. The harsh lines of trauma gradually softened into something gentler, though she never fully lost the seriousness that came from surviving the unsurvivable. But she smiled more, laughed occasionally, and once called Ethan Papa before catching herself and blushing furiously. "It's all right," Ethan had told her gently. "I'm honored to be called that. Your first papa will always be your first papa. But if you want me to be your second one, I'll do my best to live up to the title." She'd hugged him then, fierce and quick, before running off to hide her tears. But the next day she'd called him Papa again, deliberately this time, and the word had settled into their household vocabulary like it belonged there. A year after the trial, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news came with complicated emotions: joy at new life, fear of all the things that could go wrong, grief that James would never know this child. But Ethan held her through the tears and the worry, and together they chose hope over fear. The baby was born in late winter, a healthy girl with Clara's dark hair and lungs that announced her presence to the entire valley. They named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Proof that life continued, that love could grow from grief, that families could be rebuilt from ruins. Thomas and Lily doted on their sister with the fierce protectiveness of children who'd learned how precious life was. They took turns holding her, singing to her, showing her off to visitors with obvious pride. And watching them care for Hope, Ethan saw the final healing of wounds he'd feared were permanent. The transformation from children who'd lost everything into children who knew they had something worth protecting. 2 years after Crow's execution, on a spring morning that smelled of sage and new grass, Ethan stood on the porch of the ranch house and surveyed the life they'd built. Clara worked in the garden with Lily, both of them laughing at something while Hope toddled between the rows. Thomas practiced roping fence posts under Patterson's patient instruction, his throws getting more accurate with each attempt. The valley stretched out before them, peaceful and productive, home to families who worked honestly and lived without fear. The James Hale silver mine operated on the ridge to the east, its profits funding schools and hospitals and infrastructure improvements across the territory. And here, at the heart of it all, stood a ranch that had been transformed from a place of hiding into a place of hope. Clara came to stand beside him, Hope balanced on her hip, dirt smudged across her cheek from garden work. "What are you thinking about?" How a chance encounter in an alley changed everything. How mercy becomes justice becomes love if you let it. Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling his family close. How the broken pieces of different lives can fit together into something whole. "No regrets?" Clara asked softly. "About giving up your solitude, taking on a ready-made family, living with ghosts?" "The ghosts are still here. They always will be." Ethan looked at the children playing in the yard, at the baby in Clara's arms, at the woman who'd brought him back to life through sheer force of need and courage. "But they're not haunting me anymore. They're just part of the story, the sad chapters that make the happy ones possible." Thomas ran up then, breathless and excited. "Papa, can we ride to the ridge after lunch? I want to show you where I found that arrowhead yesterday." "Sure, son. We'll make a whole afternoon of it." The boy grinned and raced back to his roping practice, his joy uncomplicated and pure. Lily joined them on the porch, leaning against Ethan's other side, and hope reached out to grab his finger with her tiny fist. Standing there surrounded by family, Ethan finally understood what he'd been searching for through 3 years of isolation. Redemption didn't come from suffering or penance or running from connection. It came from choosing, every single day, to show up for the people who needed you. To stand when standing was hard. To love despite loss. To build instead of hide. The Wyoming Territory stretched around them, vast and wild and full of both beauty and danger. But here, in this small corner of wilderness, they'd created something that mattered, a home built on justice, sustained by love, protected by the kind of courage that came not from absence of fear, but from refusing to let fear have the final word. Clara kissed his cheek softly. Thank you for everything. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to come back to life. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, a family forged in fire and tempered by loss, strong enough now to face whatever the future held. And in the distance, on a mountain that had once been a place of death and greed, the James Hale silver mine stood as a monument to the truth that justice, however delayed, however costly, was always worth fighting for. The silent witness had found his voice. The broken rancher had found his family. And the widow who'd eaten garbage in an alley had proven that dignity, once reclaimed, could never be truly stolen again. Their story wasn't perfect. There would be hard days ahead, moments of struggle, memories that still hurt. But they would face them together, and that made all the difference. In the end, that's what redemption looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of people worth bearing the pain for. Not forgetting the past, but building a future that honored it. Not rescue, but partnership. Not perfection, but the messy, complicated, beautiful work of choosing love over fear, day after day after day. And as the spring wind carried the scent of sage across the valley, Ethan Cole, husband, father, rancher, and the man who'd stepped forward when others walked away, finally allowed himself to believe in second chances. Because standing on his porch with his family, surrounded by the life they'd built from ruins, he understood at last that mercy, justice, and love weren't separate things at all. They were 3 parts of the same truth, and together they could transform the world.